I am James Bradley, and this is Untold Pacific, a podcast series which mines 40 years of my life in Asia and my 4 best-selling books to create historical travelogues about the American experience on the other side of the Pacific. When the 13 American colonies were ruled by Britain, the British Parliament forbade America's colonial merchants to trade directly with China. It forced them to buy tea from British traders, and this generated a lot of tax revenue for London. Think about it. The Boston Tea Party in 1773 was a protest by American colonists against this British tax on a Chinese product. The Americans wanted in on the China trade because it was so profitable for England. For most of human history, China was the most populated, wealthiest, and most sophisticated country on earth. A book called The Travels of Marco Polo was published in 1295. In it were astonishing tales of enormous banquet rooms with 5,000 seats. The walls were studded with precious stones, and consumers were using paper money to purchase mass-printed books from well-stocked bookstores. Marco Polo was so amazed by Chinese paper money that he devoted a whole chapter to it. At this time in Europe, monks were hand-copying books, while in China, thousands of best-selling tomes were rolling off modern printing presses. China's iron manufacturing industry produced 125,000 tons a year. This was an amount not equaled by Europe until the 20th century. Chinese wore soft, luxurious silk versus the Europeans' rough-hewn tunics. At home, the Chinese lived in a stylish comfort of which Europeans could only dream. China built a suspension bridge 2,000 years before one appeared in the West. It took the English 1,700 more years than it did the Chinese to figure out how to make porcelain. Here are just some of the products of China's inventive genius. Cast iron, the crank handle, deep drilling for natural gas, the belt drive, the fishing reel, chess, matches, brandy, gunpowder, playing cards, the spinning wheel, the umbrella, and countless other innovations. The British had been making a fortune in China. So one of the first things the United States did after it got its independence was to establish trade relations with the biggest, richest country in the world, China. At the end of the American Revolutionary War in 1784, a wealthy guy from Philadelphia named Robert Morris, his nickname was the financier of the Revolution, dispatched a ship called the Empress of China to Canton. Morris had done his research well, and he knew that the Chinese prized ginseng. Ginseng was a valuable herb that grew on the shores of the Hudson River. He harvested and sent it to China. Morris's goods sold quickly in Canton, and with the proceeds, the Americans bought Chinese tea. Then they sold that profitably back in the United States. A number of East Coast merchants then pooled their resources to send ginseng, South Pacific sealskins, and Hawaiian sandalwood to China. The supply of these products soon ran out, but the Americans still desired Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. For payment, the Chinese demanded silver. Soon, the tiny, cash-poor America had a big trade imbalance with China. A few decades earlier, Britain had had their own trade imbalance with China. The British had rebalanced things with opium. Now the Americans did the same. Like grapes and ginseng, opium grows best in certain parts of the world. The prime opium-producing area was a vast stretch of fertile land that went 500 miles across the Bengal region of India. Arab merchants had dominated the Indian to China opium trade for centuries. Then the Portuguese came along and they took it over in the 16th century. Sensing the potential harm of opium to his people, the emperor outlawed the sale and use of the drug. By the 1700s, England controlled the prime opium-growing part of India, and the British Empire invested enormous sums in state-of-the-art opium farming and production systems. More than 2,000 British opium agents oversaw the efforts of 1 million registered Indian opium farmers. If you wanted to grow natural crops, the British wouldn't give you a loan. If you wanted to grow opium, they would help you out. The British dried the opium sap into balls. Each ball weighed 3.5 pounds. Then these were placed floor to ceiling in factory shelves. Indian boys would rotate each ball a quarter turn once every 6 days as it dried. Each opium ball was then stamped with the coveted trademark brand Patna or Benares. This was a brilliant move. The British had commoditized opium, high quality, branded. Western opium smugglers could not legally sell the banned drug on Chinese soil, so they installed floating wooden warehouses in the Pearl River Delta. From here, they could sell their booty to Chinese criminals who rode out under the cover of darkness. Opium was big business for the British, one of the biggest economic engines of the era. Opium soon accounted for a staggering 15 to 20% of the British Empire's revenue. The Chinese emperor had outlawed opium, so some back in England judged that this illegal business must be immoral. To evade criticism, the British government employed the ruse of selling the opium in Calcutta to a private crown-chartered enterprise, the East India Company. Then they pretended that London wasn't involved with what happened next. East India Company ships sailed the opium up the Chinese coast, and with the protection of British naval might, they used the offshore islands and anchored ships to stash the drugs. Chinese criminals would row out to the offshore drug warehouses to get the English opium. Massive bribery of local officials made the trade possible. The British were breaking Chinese law. One English merchant reflected on his work in Asia. "We are money-making, practical men. Our business is to make money, as much and as fast as we can." When America later experienced its own trade imbalance with China, Yankee traders also turned to opium. American merchants sourced a supply of opium in Turkey. Private British merchants weren't allowed to carry it, so the Americans had a monopoly on the Turkey to China opium trade. Soon, East Coast families led by the Perkins clan of Boston were raking in a fortune. One American opium merchant estimated that the Turkey to Canton opium trade turned profits of 37%. Samuel Russellton of Middletown, Connecticut, established Russell and Company, which quickly became America's biggest smuggler of Turkish opium into China. I visited Middletown, Connecticut in my research. I went to Wesleyan University. The Samuel Russell House is on the campus of Wesleyan University. It's huge. It's high on the hill. Every student at Wesleyan knows that that's the Samuel Russell House. But I asked students and even a history professor if they knew that Samuel Russell had been the American opium king of China. They didn't. Samuel Russell put out the word that he would train ambitious young men and they could score what China traders called a competence. This was a profit of $100,000 by the time they were 30 years old. The equivalent today would be somebody graduating from college and amassing a fortune of $6 to $10 million in 4 years. A fortune of that size in the then capital-poor United States would assure its owner a comfortable life of financial independence and social leadership. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's grandfather, Warren Delano, was one of the first Americans to go out to China and make a huge fortune in the illegal opium trade. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was 51 years old when he was elected President of the United States. His new job came with a salary far below his needs. Roosevelt enjoyed a wealthy man's lifestyle. He had several homes, one in New York City's East Side, another on the banks of the Hudson, and he had a third home on the coast of Maine. He also had sailing yachts and other luxuries. Roosevelt had 5 children at the time he was elected, and they cost a bundle. Yet Roosevelt never earned much money in his career. For 2 decades, he had held public service jobs. They had low pay. He had been a member of the New York State Senate, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and Governor of New York. His new title was President of the United States. That held immense power and prestige, but it had a very small salary compared to FDR's large expenditures. Luckily for Franklin and many of the rich people of his era, Grandpa Warren Delano had made a fortune in what was politely euphemized as the China trade. It was from his Delano line that Roosevelt inherited his love of the sea, his princely fortune, and his confidence that he knew how to handle China. Roosevelt later observed, "What vitality I have is not inherited from the Roosevelts. Mine comes from the Delanos." If you look through the written histories of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his Delano ancestors, they chronicle their childhoods, their schooling, their marriages, their careers, children, deaths, and legacy. But it's very curious that few have written about the source of Roosevelt's wealth. As the esteemed Roosevelt historian Jeffrey Ward wrote, "The full story of Warren Delano's career in the China trade has not been written." Warren Delano was a blue blood. His forebears had left Europe and arrived in Plymouth, Massachusetts, just 2 ships after the Mayflower. The Delanos were among the earliest settlers of the area of southern Massachusetts, the area around New Bedford and Buzzards Bay, that produced so many of America's original whalers and sea merchants. The Delanos had settled in Fairhaven, Massachusetts. Warren's father, who was also named Warren, made a big income ferrying corn, salt, and potatoes to New Orleans, England, and the Canary Islands. This first Warren helped found a Fairhaven church, the Washington Street Christian Meeting Place on Walnut Street. Today, his former residence is the Delano Homestead Bed and Breakfast. In 1842, Warren Delano Jr. graduated from Fairhaven Academy, which was a local trade school. Then he apprenticed with Boston and New York importers. Young Warren Delano's breeding and education made him one of the lucky few who caught the eye of Samuel Russell. Great Britain had decided many years earlier that the Chinese frontier was much more lucrative than America's. By sailing halfway around the world, Delano could participate in the single largest commodity trade of the 19th century, smuggling opium into China. This promised him a quick killing and world-class wealth before the age of 30. In 1833, 24-year-old Delano grabbed his big chance and sailed out of New Bedford, Massachusetts to China. Warren Delano met Samuel Russell for the first time in Macau, a small Portuguese enclave on China's coast. The foreign merchants would stay here, awaiting the 4-month trading season in which they were allowed to go into China proper. Delano began studying the many items that Russell and Company imported back to the United States, including tea. He learned its many shades and how to buy, store, and ship it. Silk, chinaware, and other items had to be accounted for in the ledger books. He had to attend to a steady flow of mail. It was an intense apprenticeship, and Delano was learning from the founder, an ideal position. Then came the exciting day when Delano sailed to China for the first time. He sailed north from Macau through the Pearl River Delta to Canton, where the Russell Company was situated on the riverbank outside Canton's walls. The Russell and Company warehouse was a compact 3-story building housing about a dozen partners. This became Delano's home. It was also a place of business and recreation, a storeroom, and even a church. The lower floor held the merchandise, kitchen, and servants' rooms. The upper floors held the offices, dining room, and traders' personal quarters. China had no foreign affairs office because it shunned official relationships with barbarian countries. Instead, the emperor managed trading relations with foreign devils through his Barbarian Management Bureau. The Barbarian Management Bureau's mandarins designed what they called the Canton system to protect ordinary Chinese from infection by foreign devils like Warren Delano. To begin with, the port of Canton in China's hot and humid south was about as far away as possible from the emperor's home in Beijing. The Canton system required that Warren Delano live and work in whitewashed warehouses located outside of Canton city walls. When the roughly 4-month trading season was over, the foreign devil traders had to leave Canton immediately. As a barbarian within the Canton system, Delano was ordered to stay put. Under no circumstances was he to enter Canton or any other city in China. Delano could not travel to the real China. He could not walk through a Chinese village. He couldn't see a rural rice paddy, and that's just how the Chinese wanted it. Delano was completely governed by the Canton system's rules. Barbarian traders like him never dealt directly with an official of the Chinese government. The odious business of interacting with foreign devils was assigned to the Hong merchants. The rules said that one of the worst crimes a Chinese person could commit was teaching the Chinese language to a barbarian. So Delano learned a pidgin English that was neither English nor Chinese. He could not carry a gun. He could not gather with others in a group larger than 10. He could not row a boat on the river. And for exercise, he could only stroll along a small strip of land. Once a year, he and other barbarian traders were allowed to walk in the gardens on the opposite shore, but only under the watchful eyes of government-appointed minders. The Russell and Company warehouse had Chinese servants to cook and clean, but these were actually spies. What little of Chinese life Warren was able to glimpse, he found downright weird. At the dinner table, his Chinese hosts placed Warren at their left as the honored guest. They kept their hats on during dinner. The food was served in bowls. The wine was warm. The Chinese ate with sticks instead of knives and forks. Chinese read their books from up to down and from right to left. The Chinese wrote their last names first. Their compasses pointed to the south. Chinese friends greeted each other by closing their hands and letting them hang limply by their sides. Porters with Warren's luggage walked in front of him. Chinese shoes were broad in front and narrow at the heel. The men wore gowns and the women wore trousers. To get their illegal opium into China, Russell and Company had established an offshore base. This was an anchored floating warehouse where Russell ships would offload their contraband. Then these ships would continue up the Pearl River Delta to Canton with their legal cargo. Later in the dark of the night, scrambling crabs, these were long, sleek, heavily armed crafts that were propelled by as many as 60 oarsmen. They would row out to the Russell and Company's floating warehouse and exchange silver for opium. The entire transaction happened quickly and allowed Delano's hands to stay clean. The dirty work, the illegal landing of the drug on Chinese soil, the bribing of officials to look the other way, the wholesaling to opium dens and retailing to street addicts, this was performed by Chinese criminal gangs. A procession of American opium traders made their fortunes smuggling opium. They were aware of its poisonous effects on the Chinese people, but few of these Americans ever mentioned opium in the thousands of pages of letters and documents they sent back to America. Robert Bennett Fords was a Russell and Company contemporary of Warren Delano's. In writing, he defended his involvement with the opium trade by noting that some of America's best families were involved. He wrote, "Those to whom I have always been accustomed to look up to as exponents of all that was honorable in trade, the Perkins, the Peabodys, the Russells, and the Lowes." Western banks, shipping companies, and insurance companies sprouted to serve this enormously profitable trade. The entire commercial infrastructure of European trade in Asia was built around opium. This English and America drug running was nearly fatal to the Middle Kingdom. Between 1814 and 1850, the trade sucked out 11% of China's money supply. China lost more silver in 30 years than had flowed into the country in 125 years leading up to the opium trade. As the Chinese money supply contracted, silver became scarce, and peasants had trouble paying their taxes. The opium trade also tore at the moral fabric of Chinese society. The sale of the banned drug was illegal. The Western smugglers' Chinese business partners were criminal lowlifes who now got rich and gathered power. But as historians have written, quote, "The British Empire could not survive were it deprived of its most important source of capital, the opium trade." On a macroeconomic level, the English and Americans had turned the tables. Chinese silver now flowed to Europe and America. But to the Chinese, the opium trade was an evil. It corrupted its officials, it demoralized its people, it drained its wealth, it raised the cost of living, and it undermined the emperor's authority. In their cramped and restricted situation in their warehouse, Delano and his fellows fantasized about having Western enclaves where they could conduct themselves as they wished, under their own rules, without the Chinese Canton system. The American missionaries who were just beginning to arrive shared these desires. The Barbarian Management Bureau had threatened American churchmen with beheading if they were caught spreading the evil religion of Christianity. By 1838, with their country's military might supporting them, missionaries insisted on the right not only to preach, but also to build schools, hospitals, churches, and cemeteries on Chinese soil, to learn the Chinese language, and in general to be left alone in their quest to change pagans into Americanized and Christianized New Chinese. In 1839, when Warren Delano was 30 years old and the number 2 partner in Russell and Company, the tension between East and West exploded all around him. For the previous 2 years, Governor Lin of Hunan Province had suppressed the sale and use of opium in Hunan. The emperor now transferred Commissioner Lin to Canton to stamp out the opium trade there. Commissioner Lin demanded that Delano and the other foreign devils come clean and hand over their opium stocks. The English and Americans coyly replied they had no opium. Commissioner Lin tightened the screws by surrounding their warehouses with troops and withdrawing their Chinese servants. Warren Delano suddenly found himself cooking his own meals in the Russell and Company kitchen. To break out of their hopeless situation, the traders eventually forfeited their opium. Only the biggest English smugglers turned over more than Delano. Then, with cheering Chinese watching, Commissioner Lin had 3 enormous trenches dug. Day after day, workers shoveled the seized opium into the water-filled gullies, mixed it with salt and lime, and then flushed the mixture out into the ocean. This work commenced on June 3, 1839, and it took a total of 23 days to flush out all the Western opium. I've been to the monument outside of Guangzhou, the old Canton, which memorializes Commissioner Lin trying to get rid of the Westerners' opium. If you go there for yourself, you can feel what the Chinese mean by the phrase century of humiliation. Today, President Trump is demanding that Mexico do something about the flow of drugs across America's border. If you go to New York City's Chinatown, you'll see a statue they have raised to Commissioner Lin. He was the Chinese official who asked Warren Delano to please stop bringing opium into China. In London, Buckingham Palace shook at the news of Commissioner Lin's actions. Queen Victoria was only 20 years old at this point, on the British throne for less than 2 years. When the Chinese threatened to cut off her single biggest source of income, she understood the dire financial consequences. Opium smuggling into China not only paid for imports from China, but the drug trade also provided the easy money that most sustained her empire. In November of 1839, Queen Victoria dispatched her navy to China. They bombarded China's coast. This shocked the Chinese. They had built the Great Wall in the north to keep the northern barbarians out. They had never imagined that they would be humbled by Western seafarers who came from the south into Canton. Thus began the First Opium War, which lasted until 1842. The First Opium War was a boom time for Warren Delano. Valuable cargoes from all over the world were coming into Canton, but British traders had to observe the British blockade of China. So Warren Delano used the opportunity. He rented or purchased every ship he could, and then he charged high transport fees. Delano's accomplishments were recognized in the midst of the war. On January 1st, 1840, the 31-year-old was named the senior partner of Russell & Company. Russell & Company's senior partners often served as U.S. consuls to Canton. This was an honorific but empty title because the Chinese would still not tolerate state-to-state relations with barbarians. Appointed U.S. consul in 1841, Warren Delano cheered the British bombing of China, and he welcomed the first U.S. warship to come to China to protect American interests. A modern industrialized military was too much for the Chinese. They had no effective way to defend themselves. Ravaged on sea and land, China capitulated and signed the Treaty of Nanking. This is the first of what many Chinese still consider the odious, unequal treaties by which the West would chip away at China's sovereignty. China was forced to pay Britain millions and abolish the Canton system. Most alarming, the Treaty of Nanking required China to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain and to open 5 ports to trade. These were called treaty ports. In treaty ports, foreigners enjoyed extraterritoriality. This was freedom from Chinese laws and the right to try their own transgressors. This was just like the European incursions onto the American continent in the 1860s. White Christians had created an archipelago of trading hubs where Western ways could root and flourish. With the Canton system destroyed, the drug trade exploded. Soon the British governor of Hong Kong wrote to his London masters, "Almost every person not connected with government is employed in the opium trade." The British Empire grew fat on Chinese silver drained from the formerly richest country in the world. The sums were so enormous that Queen Victoria stands today as history's largest drug dealer. The Americans came in second. By 1843, Warren Delano had spent a momentous decade in the China trade. He had achieved his financial competence. He was a rich young man. He had risen to become the head partner of the biggest American firm dealing with China. With opium, he had helped reverse the American balance of trade deficit with China. He had helped destroy the Canton system, helped humiliate the Chinese government. He had helped create treaty ports. Over his 10 years in China, he had seen Westerners like himself transform themselves from huddled supplicants into victors who dictated the terms. Delano decided to return to Massachusetts for a short vacation. When he returned to Massachusetts, Warren Delano was viewed as a wealthy young man who had made his fortune in China by dealing in teas, silks, and porcelain. Though considered one of a handful of American experts on China, Delano had actually never explored the country or its culture. In Massachusetts, Warren Delano met and married 18-year-old Catherine Lyman. He had met her through John Murray Forbes, another man who had made his wealth by smuggling opium. In 1843, Warren and Catherine Delano returned to the China trade. For 3 years, the couple lived in Macau in a grand mansion called Arrowdale. On July 3, 1844, a meeting that would have been inconceivable just a few years earlier took place between an American and Chinese government officials. At a table in the Temple of Kunyan in Macau, a Massachusetts friend of Warren Delano's named Caleb Cushing sat across from a Chinese official, and they signed a U.S.-China agreement modeled on the Nanking Treaty. Before this, for half a century, relations between the United States and China had been strictly commercial. Now, after his country had been pummeled by the combined might of a number of Western navies, a Chinese official had greeted a representative of the United States, and they had negotiated the U.S.-China diplomatic and economic relationship. This treaty allowed 5 new treaty ports. Americans would be walking around these districts protected by extraterritoriality. Americans like Warren Delano could rule supreme. They could buy land, erect homes, start businesses in these protected pockets, and the Chinese could not interfere. Every American who came to China now could consider himself a member of a superior civilization, a co-conqueror of the world's oldest empires. Americans with names like Delano, Russell, Cushing, Perkins, Forbes, Green, and others, these had helped transform coastal China into a quasi-colony for foreign drug dealers. When Warren and Catherine Delano returned to the United States in 1846, they assumed their place in the ranks of East Coast society. They purchased a fabulous townhouse at 39 Lafayette Square in New York City. Their neighbors included Washington Irving and John Jacob Astor. New Yorkers now know this area of Manhattan as Astor Place. The opium trade had turned America's trade deficit with China into a trade surplus. All that silver extracted from China had an enormous impact on the young United States. Few people today realize that opium merchants like Warren Delano provided the seed corn for the economic revolution in America. Delano invested his new fortune in a host of ventures: New York waterfront property, railroads, copper mines in Tennessee and Maryland, coal mines in Pennsylvania. A town in Pennsylvania was named Delano in his honor. The Perkins family, who had pioneered the transport of Turkish opium to China, built Boston's Athenaeum, the Massachusetts General Hospital, and the Perkins Institution for the Blind. America's first railroad was the Quincy Granite Railway. This was built to carry stones from Perkins quarries to the site of the Bunker Hill Monument. Opium money funded the construction of America's first great textile manufacturing city, Lowell, Massachusetts. America's great East Coast universities owe a great deal to opium profits. Russell family money bought the land that Yale University now sits on. A Russell family trust covers the budget of Yale's Skull and Bones Society. Russell funds built the famously secretive club's headquarters. The most recognizable building on the Columbia University campus is the Low Memorial Library. This honors Abiel Abbott Low. He worked in China with Warren Delano in the 1830s. John Cleve Green was Warren Delano's immediate predecessor as a senior partner in Russell & Company. John Cleve Green became Princeton University's single largest donor. He financed 3 buildings. Green also founded America's oldest orthopedic hospital, Manhattan's Hospital for Special Surgery. This all came from his opium fortune. Opium families financed railroads across the country. The Perkins family built the Boston and Lowell Railroad. The Forbes family built the Michigan Central Railroad. Another Forbes family built the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. The Low family built the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, and it goes on and on. The influence of these opium fortunes seeped into virtually every aspect of American life. The influence was cultural. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the transcendentalist, had married John Murray Forbes' daughter. His father-in-law's opium fortune helped provide Emerson with the cushion to become a professional thinker. The influence of opium money was found in technology. John Murray Forbes helped found the Bell Telephone Company. Abiel Abbott Low, a friend of Warren Delano's, provided startup money for the first transatlantic cable. And the influence of opium money was ideological. Joseph Coolidge's heirs founded the Council on Foreign Relations. Many companies were started by opium profits. The Coolidge family used its opium money to found the United Fruit Company. Scratch the history of an institution or a person with the name Forbes, and there's a good chance that you'll see opium in the background. Former Secretary of State John Forbes Carey's great-grandfather was Francis Blackwell Forbes. He got rich selling opium in China. In 1852, Warren Delano and his family moved to their dream house, a brown and buff mansion on 6 acres overlooking the Hudson River. Delano named this Algonac, and he furnished his home with Chinese decor. Now in his 40s, Delano regaled guests with colorful stories of trading tea and silk in China, but he rarely mentioned opium. The adventures of the American opium kings in China have been washed out of America's history. Years later, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's son Elliot wrote, quote, "Delano ships sailing out of New Bedford made the family rich on the sale of opium," unquote. But none of Warren's stories told at Algonac revealed this fact. Robert Bennett Forbes had known Warren Delano when they both worked for Russell and Company in China. Back in the United States, Robert Bennett Forbes asked Warren Delano to write some reminiscences of the old China trade. Warren responded with a short letter, but he never mentioned the main source of his fortune. Warren Delano lived well until stocks crashed and the banks collapsed in the financial panic of 1857. One by one, he watched his investments sour. Delano was suddenly faced with a grim financial future. 48 years old and slowly going broke, he thought long and hard about what to do next. He still had great contacts with leading businessmen across the United States. He had been an investor in railroads, property, copper, and coal mines. He was healthy, and despite the crash, the American economy still offered plenty of opportunity. But with a growing family and an expensive manor lifestyle to support, he wanted to make a lot of money quickly. So Warren Delano returned to the most profitable business in the world, dealing opium. It wasn't an easy decision. Opium smuggling was a young man's game. Delano had been only 24 years old when he had first sailed to China. Now he was twice that. The trip to Hong Kong was an arduous 4-month-long voyage. In hot and humid South China, he risked contracting malaria or life-threatening dysentery. But after 14 years of playing by the rules in the U.S. economy, he was confronting a reduced standard of living. It was time, Warren concluded, to go back to the game with no rules. It took almost 2 years for Russell and Company to repost Delano to Hong Kong. By then, at 50 years old, Warren had 8 children and his wife Catherine was pregnant with a 9th. As he left his family, he gave an empty stamp book to his 5-year-old daughter, Sarah Delano. He promised her that he would send her letters and stamps. Sarah Delano later became the mother of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. She later gave this stamp book to her only son. Working on his Delano stamp collection became President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's favorite hobby. In 1859, Delano sailed to the British colony of Hong Kong. Once again, he became the senior official in America's biggest firm in China, and he proceeded to rebuild his fortune. The tables had really turned since the early days. The Barbarian Management Bureau had naively assumed that the Western opium merchants would be satisfied with Hong Kong and the 5 treaty ports granted in 1843. But now that the Chinese had given an inch, the Westerners insisted upon a mile. The British, French, and American foreign devils wanted China to rescind its prohibition and legalize opium. They wanted China to cut duties on internal trade and adopt English as the official language of all future treaties and allow official state-to-state relations between China and Western countries. The Westerners were demanding the right to poison 300 million Chinese people with their opium. All this while continuing to stay beyond the reach of the emperor's jurisdiction. Just as shocking to the Chinese, the Westerners demanded that their ambassadors be allowed to live in Beijing near the emperor. When the Barbarian Management Bureau refused these demands, the British, French, and American navies retaliated with the Second Opium War. This time they ravaged not only the coastal cities and forts, but also the country's interior. They invaded Beijing, chased the emperor out of town, and in an orgy of fine art and jewelry looting, they destroyed the Versailles of China, the old Summer Palace. The Summer Palace was considered by many to be the pinnacle work of Chinese art. It had huge gardens, enormous buildings, beautiful architecture. It had fantastic art collections and historical treasures. The palace was so large, it covered almost 18 acres, that it took 4,000 men 3 days of burning to destroy it. Many exquisite artworks, sculptures, porcelain, jade, silk robes, textiles, gold objects, and more, were stolen and now are found in 47 museums around the world. You can visit today the ruins of the Summer Palace outside of Beijing. You can walk among the crumbled marble, and you understand what the Chinese mean when they talk about the century of humiliation. Overwhelmed again, China bent. A new and even more unequal treaty gave the United States and other nations the right to station their diplomats in Beijing. It also pried open 10 more treaty ports to foreign trade, and it allowed foreign vessels to go up the Yangtze, thus giving Westerners access to the deepest heart of China. Crucially for the Americans, the agreement ordered the Chinese government to stop using the word barbarian in reference to Westerners like them. Finally, the Barbarian Management Bureau was abolished, and it was replaced by a foreign ministry forced into relations with barbarian countries. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a young boy in the late 1800s, his mother's favorite stories revolved around a fantastic adventure to a faraway land. Sarah Delano Roosevelt told her son the story about how her mother, Catherine, packed up the family and on June 25, 1862, sailed out of New York Harbor on a fully crewed ship with 9 children, 2 maids, an upright piano, crates of clothes and books, and a hold stuffed with caged pigs, ducks, geese, and chickens. They were off to China. They sailed for 4 months of sometimes stormy nights and many becalmed days. On September 21, 1892, the Delano family was in the Indian Ocean. They celebrated Sarah's 8th birthday with a dinner of roast goose, boiled ham, corned peas, tomatoes, rice, and cake. On the morning of October 31, 1862, the Delano ship sailed into the Hong Kong harbor. "Papa," little Sarah squealed as Warren Delano came into view. He was standing at the tiller of a Russell and Company launch that was being rowed by a dozen white uniformed Chinese. Delano came aboard, and little Sarah hugged her father's leg. The stories young Franklin Delano Roosevelt heard from his mother of the 2 years she spent in Hong Kong were mostly about her experiences within the confines of the Rose Hill estate. Those 2 years were pleasant, but they were monotonous. Sarah mingled with the same small group of people. She ventured out only for American-style pursuits like a day at the racetrack, and then she had to be accompanied by her father or other adult male Russell and Company employees. Sarah Delano never learned the Chinese language. Other than her father's Chinese servants, little Sarah had almost no contact with the locals. She could later tell Franklin stories about the peacocks on the property, and she recalled in detail Thanksgiving dinners, but Sarah passed on no insights about the real China. How could she? It's likely that Sarah Delano's single experience with a Chinese person's home was on a family visit to a Hong merchant's fabulous Canton mansion in February of 1863. She was 9 years old. This would be the equivalent of a foreigner in America dining at the Astor Mansion and nowhere else. Sarah wrote that before this adventure, quote, "Papa told us children to pretend that we liked Chinese food, though it was very strange to us," unquote. After 5 months in China, the Delano children had apparently not eaten any Chinese food. Certainly, they did not know how to use chopsticks. Sarah and the family marveled at the merchant's opulent mansion. They strolled through rooms furnished with polished ebony and gleaming marble. When they sat down to dinner, Sarah was relieved. She later wrote that there were knives, forks, and spoons for us strangers. By 1886, the Delano clan was back in the United States. Warren Delano had done it. He was back at Algonac, surrounded by opulent Chinese furnishings. Once again, he was a rich man telling colorful stories about the China trade, but he did not speak the name of the drug that had made it all possible. The year of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's birth, 1882, was a watershed year for U.S.-China relations. Before 1882, the concept of illegal immigration did not exist in America. All foreigners had been welcomed to its shores. That changed with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. For the first time, the U.S. was excluding non-whites from the country. For years after the establishment of the Chinese Exclusion Act, Americans would not behold a Chinese person. The Chinese remaining in the United States were huddled in their Chinatowns. Like the Indians on their reservations, they were invisible to most Americans. The majority of Americans were now cut off from the people of the world's most populous country. Americans were now unable to form direct relationships with Chinese and take their measure. This left an enormous void of understanding. Franklin attended America's best private college, Harvard. But Harvard offered no courses in the Chinese language or philosophy. Franklin Roosevelt never crossed the Pacific to see China for himself. But China came alive in the mind of young Franklin as he listened to stories about old China from his mother, grandfather, aunts, and uncles. But in truth, these people did not know the real China. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was married to his cousin Eleanor Roosevelt in a ceremony on Manhattan's 76th Street just off Fifth Avenue on March 17, 1905. The minister who performed the ceremony was Reverend Endicott Peabody. A majority of the wedding guests had something in common. Their families had made their fortunes in the China opium trade. Eleanor's jewelry and Franklin's money came not from the Roosevelts, but from the Delano line. Reverend Peabody was wealthy because his grandfather, Joseph Peabody, had made a fortune dealing drugs in China. Paul Forbes was the descendant of the man who replaced Warren Delano as consul in Canton. A man named A. Lowe was there. He was a descendant of Warren Delano's opium friend, Abiel Abbott Lowe. The bloodlines of many of the guests intertwined owing to numerous marriages among the Cushings, Cabots, and other families. These were all clans with roots in the most profitable commodity trade of the 19th century. These were the offspring of the men who used opium to reverse America's first trade deficit with China. Because of his Delano heritage, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt always believed that he had special insight into China. After a meeting to discuss China policy with the president, one official recalled, "We might as well have saved our breath." Roosevelt put an end to the meeting by looking up and telling us, "Please remember, I have a background of a little over a century in Chinese affairs."